At 11 p.m. during my daughter's wedding, she found me among the guests, her eyes red. I took her aside and asked, "What happened?" She hugged me and sobbed. I went to the restroom and saw Mom with the best man. They were kissing. On my wedding day, Dad. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Valentin Herrero Castillo. I'm 59, a civil engineer, and for 31 years I've been building structures that withstand the test of time: bridges, viaducts, buildings that are still standing and will be when I'm gone. I've always believed that the solidity of any construction depends on its foundations, that if the base is good, nothing brings it down. For 28 years, I applied that same logic to my marriage. I thought if you worked hard, stayed faithful, put family above everything else, things just endured. I was wrong in a way that I still find hard to say out loud. On Saturday, October 14th, 2023, my daughter Neria Herrero Vazquez, 29, married Inigo Salcedo Pena, 31, at the Parador de Cardona, a medieval fortress in the province of Barcelona, which Neria had chosen 2 years earlier, cause she said she wanted to marry in a place that had survived time. Inigo's an architect, and he has that way of looking at spaces that makes you feel like you're seeing something others can't. I liked him from day one. Not all fathers can honestly say that about their son-in-law. My wife Remedios Vazquez Olmedo, 56, had spent months organizing every detail of that wedding. The flowers, the menu, the music, the table arrangements. 142 guests, white flowers and olive branches on linen tablecloths. Warm lights suspended from the medieval stone ceilings. The result was stunning, and that afternoon, as I walked through the prepared hall, I felt a genuine pride that now, remembering it, fills me with something very much like disgust. I was proud of everything, of Neria, of the place, of what I believed we'd built together. That morning, as Neria pinned the white flower to my suit lapel, she told me with a smile, "Don't cry yet, Dad. There's still a lot of day left." I didn't know how right she was. I decided not to drink alcohol that night. I wanted to remember everything with the same precision I'd spent years documenting engineering projects. So I spent hours with a glass of mineral water in my hand, observing the guests, watching Neria dance, storing each image in my memory, like archiving blueprints you know you'll need someday. Gustavo Llorente Aranda was there, as expected. 52 years old, groom's best man, Inigo's friend since architecture school, and known to us for almost a decade, since Inigo started bringing him to family dinners. An ordinary man, one of those you don't particularly remember until a very specific reason appears not to forget them. That night, the reason appeared. It was exactly 11:47 p.m. when I saw Neria crossing the hall, looking for me among the guests. I recognized her before I saw her face clearly. My daughter always tilts her body slightly to the left when she's nervous. An involuntary gesture she inherited from me, and we've both never corrected it. That night, the tilt was so pronounced that for an instant, I thought something physical had happened to her. I moved toward her without thinking. When she was in front of me, something in my chest slammed shut. Her makeup was smudged under her eyes, her eyelids slightly swollen, the expression of someone who'd just seen something they couldn't unsee no matter how hard they tried. "Dad," she said very softly. Just that, my fatherly name, with the same intonation as when she was little, and came looking for me in the studio at night cause she'd had a nightmare and knew I'd be awake. I gently took her arm and guided her to the side corridor that connected the hall to the outdoor gardens. A narrow hallway, dimly lit by just 2 wall sconces, with no guests or service staff. When the door closed behind us, the music was muffled until it became something distant, almost unreal. "What happened?" I asked her. She shook her head, looked both ways, her fingers found my forearm, and squeezed harder than I would have expected from her. "I don't want to ruin your night, Dad. I don't want this. But I can't stay quiet either. Neria," I put my hand on hers. "Tell me what you saw." She looked up at me. She was 29, but at that moment she looked much younger. She took a single breath. I went to the bathroom, and when I came out, I saw Mom with Gustavo in the back corridor near the service bathrooms. Dad, they were kissing. It wasn't a misunderstanding. I saw them. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I'm sorry, Dad. The glass of mineral water was still in my left hand. The cold glass left a red mark on my fingers from squeezing it so hard without realizing. I don't know how long I spent saying nothing. Probably less than a minute. But it was one of those minutes that expand inward and contain too many things. Are you sure? Yes, without hesitation, with that kind of certainty that hurts more than any possible explanation. I breathed slowly, the same way I've learned to breathe when excavation ground unexpectedly gives way, unhurriedly, without panic, calculating the next move before executing it. Listen to me, I said softly. Tonight's yours. What you just told me isn't going to change that. Tonight, I'm going in. I'm going to smile, and no one's going to know this conversation happened, understand? Neria looked at me for a few long seconds. And you? I'm fine. It was a lie, but it was the only answer I could give her that night. We entered the hall together. The music was still playing. The 142 guests were still dancing, drinking, laughing, completely oblivious to what had just happened a few meters from them. Remedios was in her chair chatting with Inigo's mother, with a glass of wine in her hand and the same smile I'd loved for 28 years. I watched her from across the room, and for the first time in almost 3 decades, that face seemed completely strange to me. I spent the next 43 minutes standing next to the stone column closest to the exit, with a glass of mineral water in my hand and an expression I'd carefully rehearsed over the first few days. Quiet attention, discreet presence, the face of a satisfied father who had fulfilled everything expected of him that day. It wasn't the first time I'd used that composure outside of work. In 30 years of civil engineering, I've learned to listen to ruinous proposals without my face betraying what my brain just calculated. I've discovered serious structural flaws in the middle of a site inspection and conveyed the news with the same serenity with which I'd give good results. It's a skill you build without realizing it, based on situations where showing what you feel changes absolutely nothing. I never imagined I'd need it someday at my own daughter's wedding. Remedios returned to her chair next to Inigo's mother and resumed the conversation without any visible sign of what had happened minutes earlier. She laughed, nodded, leaned forward with that characteristic gesture of hers when something truly interested her. The wine glass was almost empty. She finished it slowly and accepted another serving without hesitation. I watched her from a distance for a few moments. She was the same woman I'd had breakfast with that morning, the same one who'd adjusted the handkerchief in my suit pocket before leaving home and said I looked handsome, the same one I'd danced 3 slow songs with that night, her head resting against my shoulder, as if time hadn't moved at all since the early years. That same woman. Gustavo entered the hall approximately 12 minutes after her through the same side door, adjusted his tie knot, exchanged greetings with 2 people en route, and sat 3 tables away from where Remedios was, not at his table all night, not too far. The exact margin chosen by 2 people with enough experience to have calculated what distance becomes invisible. It was at that instant that I understood with a clarity that hurt more than the initial impact. What Neria had seen wasn't a spontaneous act of a celebratory night. It was the movement of 2 people with routine, with a system they'd calibrated for long enough to work without drawing anyone's attention. I watched them for the rest of the evening with the same concentration one uses to inspect a complex structure for a flaw no one has yet located, without fixing my gaze on them for more than 3 consecutive seconds, without any gesture that could be misinterpreted, but registering every exchange, every angle, every moment their paths crossed without appearing deliberate. At 12:16, as the newlyweds cut the cake, Gustavo crossed the hall to greet a group of Inigo's colleagues and brushed past Remedios' table. There was no pause, no contact, but she looked up at him for exactly the duration of a blink, and he lowered his eyes to her at that same instant. No one who didn't know what I knew would have noticed it. I mentally noted it with the exact time. At 1 a.m., Neria and Inigo began their goodbyes before retreating to the Parador suite that Remedios and I had reserved for them as a gift. Neria hugged me for longer than any celebratory hug lasts. Her hand squeezed my back with a force that belonged to another moment. "Dad," she whispered against my shoulder. "Everything's fine," I replied. I slowly pulled away from her. I took her face in my hands for a moment and held her gaze. There is something in her expression that went beyond bridal emotion, something akin to the face of someone who has carried a weight for too long and has just passed it on. At that moment, I didn't analyze it deeply. I had enough with what I was already carrying. Guests started leaving between 1:30 and 2. Remedios went around the newlyweds table collecting envelopes and a small bouquet someone had forgotten, with her usual efficiency for managing closures. I watched her do all that and thought I knew her by heart. Every gesture, every habit, every pattern accumulated in almost 3 decades of shared life. What I hadn't been able to see was everything happening underneath. In the Parador parking lot at 2:15 a.m., the October air carried the smell of damp stone and open country. I opened the car door for Remedios, as I'd been doing since before we were an official couple. One of those automatisms so old that the brain no longer consciously registers them. "It was a beautiful night," she said as she settled into the seat and buckled up. "Yes," I replied. I drove the 94 kilometers back to Barcelona in almost total silence. Remedios talked about the menu, the centerpieces, how nice Inigo's family seemed to her. I responded with only what was strictly necessary. She attributed my silence to the day's accumulated fatigue. I know her assumptions as well as I discovered that night how little she considers mine. We got home at 3:42. I showered in the guest bathroom with the excuse of not waking her. In reality, I needed 10 minutes when I didn't have to control my own expression. There, standing under the hot water with the mirror beginning to fog up, something I'd held up for almost 5 hours broke. It wasn't noisy crying. It was the silent variety, the kind that needs no witnesses and therefore is much harder to contain. When I entered the bedroom, Remedios was sleeping on her side, or pretending to. After 28 years together, I couldn't tell the difference anymore. And that single uncertainty revealed more about the true state of our marriage than any concrete evidence that might come in the following days. I lay down on my side of the bed. The room was completely dark. Less than 50 centimeters away, her breathing remained calm and regular, completely oblivious to everything. I stared at the ceiling from 4:15 until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the blinds. Lying next to the woman who had broken something irreparable, I did the only thing I know how to do well when a structure fails without warning and the damage is irreversible. I started calculating. Sunday dawned with fine rain over Barcelona and the smell of freshly brewed coffee that Remedios has prepared unfailingly since our first years living together. I got up before she left the bedroom. I showered, dressed, poured myself a cup, and sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper open in front of me. I've been doing that on Sundays for years. It was part of the weekend structure, as automatic as reviewing blueprints before site inspection. When Remedios appeared in the doorway in her bathrobe and loose hair, she greeted me with routine intact. A brief kiss on the head, the question of whether I wanted more coffee, a comment about the weather outside. Everything exactly the same as any other Sunday of the last 28 years. I replied with the same naturalness. More coffee? Yes. The weather's unpleasant. Yes. A short sentence about how tired we'd been the night before. It was the first breakfast of a stage she didn't yet know had begun. That Sunday we spent at home with the particular slowness of autumn. Remedios made a long call to her sister. I went to the study and opened the computer with the excuse of checking impending budget, but in reality, I stayed for almost 20 minutes without moving a single muscle, fingers on the keyboard and a blank screen. There's a phase in any engineering project that my colleagues call the engineer's pause, the moment when someone poses a structural problem and I don't respond immediately. I process. I evaluate loads. I identify stress points. I calculate margins before speaking. I don't act until I have complete clarity on exactly what the failure is and what the most effective intervention to address it is. I applied that with all the coldness I had available. Monday, I returned to the office. Herrero y Asociados occupies the 4th floor of a building in Izample that I supervised during its renovation 12 years ago. I know every centimeter of that space, the proportions, the load lines, the way light enters through the windows depending on the time of day. There I think with precision. My partner and operations director, Amparo Delgado Vieira, 54, found me that Monday with an expression that must have seemed slightly different from usual because she asked me if I'd rested well after the wedding. Not much, I replied with partial honesty, the emotion of the day. She nodded and didn't press. We've been working together for 16 years and have built a mutual respect that includes knowing when not to push. That week, I worked with a concentration I hadn't experienced since the most demanding months of a public works contract we managed in 2016. While reviewing blueprints, attending meetings, and signing documents, a part of my mind worked in parallel, methodical and unhurried, organizing what I already knew and outlining what I needed to find out. Remedios at home showed no sign of alteration. That was precisely what disturbed me most during those first few days. I had expected, without consciously formulating it, some change in behavior, something slightly forced, an excessive kindness that betrayed guilt or a subtle distance that revealed discomfort, any crack in the surface to which I could respond. There was none of that. She was simply Remedios. She cooked, managed the household agenda, received messages from Miria about the first days of her honeymoon, and read them aloud during dinner with the smile of a satisfied mother. She asked me how work had gone. She commented on minor things about the neighborhood, shopping, plans for the next weekend, and I responded. I followed the thread of each conversation with the normalcy of someone who doesn't carry the weight I carried. It was Wednesday night when the first moment occurred that almost fractured my composure. We were finishing dinner when Remedios casually mentioned Gustavo, commenting that Inigo had sent her a digital wedding album and that Gustavo had looked very good in the group photos. I looked up from my plate, just in time to hold her gaze without anything in mind trembling. Yes, I said, and lowered my eyes back to the plate. There was no pause, no inflection in my voice, but under the table, my right hand squeezed the napkin with a force that left the cloth wrinkled in a way that wouldn't recover with washing. On Thursday morning, before leaving for the office, I opened the bank app on my phone while Remedios was in the bathroom. I reviewed the movements of our joint checking account for the last 3 months. The usual ones, the ones I recognized, and 2 periodic transfers of €450 each to an account I didn't immediately identify. They appeared with a reference that looked like any vendor code. They weren't amounts that would have triggered any alarm in another context. In this context, they changed everything. I closed the app the moment I heard the bathroom door open. I calmly put my phone away and poured myself the last coffee of the morning. I'll be late today, Remedios warned me as she searched for her keys in her purse. I'm meeting Sonia for something downtown. Sonia Ramos __, her friend since university, 49, divorced, a high school teacher in Gracia, a real person whose existence had been verified in our social life for years. Perfect, I replied. I'll be leaving work late, too. I left first in the elevator with no one else there. For a few seconds, I let my jaw relax and my shoulders drop from the position I'd held them in for days. It was like exhaling after too long a dive. Then I breathed, composed myself, and when the October air of Barcelona hit my face as I stepped out the portal, I made the decision I'd been maturing since the night of the 14th. I needed certainties, not assumptions born of pain, concrete facts documented with verifiable names, dates, and figures, the kind of evidence that admits no alternative interpretation, and for that, I needed professional help. That morning, from the private office with the door closed, I searched for the name of a lawyer specializing in family law whom I'd heard mentioned 2 years ago among colleagues. I didn't remember the exact context of that conversation, but the name had stuck with the fidelity of Data One archives, without yet knowing what they'll be needed for. Rafael Montoya Ibarra. I dialed his office number. His secretary informed me the lawyer had availability the following Monday. I confirmed the appointment for 10 a.m. I hung up. I placed the phone on the table and returned to the blueprint spread before me. A viaduct in preliminary design phase, lines, dimensions, technical specifications that demand a precision that forgives no errors. There was the difference between what I did professionally and what I was about to do in my private life. In engineering, one calculates to build structures that last. What I was calculating now served a completely different purpose: to surgically dismantle what someone had built for years right under my feet. Monday dawned with that dry cold of mid-October that in Barcelona usually arrives without warning, settling with more firmness than expected. I arrived at Rafael Montoya Ibarra's office 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with my coat still on, mentally reviewing what I was going to say. It wasn't the first time I prepared for a complicated meeting. In 30 years of civil engineering, I've had to communicate budget collapses, impossible deadlines, and technical reports no one wanted to hear. But none of those meetings required starting by admitting that I myself had been the blind spot of the problem for years. Rafael Montoya Ibarra was about 58, dark gray suit, calm hands resting on the table, and that way of listening characteristic of someone who's heard too many similar stories for any to alter their pulse. He offered me coffee. I declined. He indicated I should start when ready. It took me less time than I expected. I laid out the facts with the same structure I used to present a technical report. Strict chronological order, verifiable data, without embellishments that would cloud understanding. The October 14th wedding, what Neria had seen, the irregular bank movements I detected days earlier, the growing certainty since the Sunday after the wedding that what had happened that night wasn't an isolated episode, but the visible part of something patiently built over a long time. We spent an hour and 20 minutes analyzing the community property regime, the assets linked to Herrero y Asociados, the separation of assets, and the legal scope of the periodic transfers from the joint account. While I went out into the street, I carried in my coat's inner pocket the name of a private investigator Montoya, habitually used in similar cases. Emilio Cuadrado Herbas, 46, 15 years of experience in asset investigation and personal surveillance. I called him that same afternoon from the car parked in front of the office with the engine off. We agreed to meet the following Thursday at a cafe in the Sarria neighborhood that he chose. But as the professional process began to articulate itself, something parallel and equally inevitable advanced in the quietest part of my mind. In the construction sector, there's a technical procedure called forensic failure analysis. It involves going back to the origin of a collapse, reviewing every decision made during the process, and locating the exact point where the degradation began that no one detected in time. It's not done to punish. It's done to understand. And understanding in engineering, as in anything else, is the first step before any effective intervention. That's what I was doing with the last few years of my marriage. The first memory that took on another meaning was a Saturday in May 2020. Remedios arrived 2 hours later than expected with the explanation of traffic returning from her sister's house in Sobbed. I believed her without any reservation, but now I remembered with a clarity that hurt that same afternoon I had sent a message to her sister about a completely minor matter, and she had responded from home without ever mentioning that Remedios was there. I filed the detail as a misunderstanding of schedules and forgot about it before the day was over. Second memory, December 2021, Inigo's company dinner, which Gustavo also attended. Neria told me days later that at some point that night her mother and Gustavo were talking apart from the group for a considerable time. She said it very casually, as an insignificant observation. I didn't give it any importance. It was a social gathering. People talk. Third memory, February 2022. Remedios started going to the gym 3 mornings a week. I received it as good news because I've been telling her for a while that moving more would do her good. I never asked which gym. I never checked the address on the membership receipt that came out of the joint account each month. I never considered that this activity could be anything other than what she said it was. Fourth memory, and this one came unbidden. Summer 2022. Gustavo showed up at the barbecue Inigo organized at his parents' house. Remedios was already there when I arrived, almost an hour before the agreed time, with the explanation that she'd gone to help with the preparations. No one questioned anything. No one had reason to. I was glad to see her cheerful, sociable, happy. I remember her that way for weeks. Engineering manuals describe a category of failure called excessive reliance on the original design. When a structure has gone years without incidents, technicians reduce the frequency of reviews because the positive history creates a sense of security that time may not be justifying. The system collapses precisely because no one anticipated it. That's what I'd done with my marriage. The solidity of the early years wasn't a guarantee of those that came after. It was simply a history that I had interpreted as permanent. And then there was the money. Montoya had asked me for the joint bank statements of the last 3 years. That night, while Remedios was watching a series in the living room, I settled into the study with the excuse of reviewing a pending file and spent almost 90 minutes transferring bank movements to a spreadsheet. The 2 periodic transfers of €450 I detected days earlier were only the most recent ones. Tracing back, I found the same pattern since January 2021. Amounts ranging from €300 to €800, monthly or bi-monthly, to the same destination account identified with a reference that looked like any vendor code. In 22 months, the accumulated total exceeded €12,000. It wasn't a sum that would destroy a stable household economy, but it wasn't an accounting error either. It was €12,000 withdrawn with the precision of someone who knows exactly what threshold not to cross to avoid raising any alarms. Amounts that seem normal when considered individually, but when arranged in a column and added up, reveal a methodology that sustained will over time. I closed the spreadsheet, saved the file with a password I'd never used for any household document, and deleted the browser history. When I entered the living room, Remedios looked up from the screen. "Finished with that file?" "Almost," I replied. "I'll close it tomorrow." I sat beside her without hurrying, less than a meter away, with every piece of data still moving inside my head, aligning themselves into the structure of something that already had a shape, but didn't yet have a complete name. She turned her attention back to the screen. I imitated her without seeing anything on it, and I thought, with the particular serenity of someone who has learned to diagnose damage without losing the ability to act, that what I had in my hands was no longer an intuition or an unfounded suspicion. It was documentation. And documentation, well-built and well-guarded, has a property that no lie can neutralize. It lasts. Thursday arrived with the kind of punctuality one only appreciates after spending days counting hours. The Cafe Emilio Cuadrado Herbas had chosen in Sarria was one of those neighborhood spots that had been the same place for decades without needing renovation. Marble tables with worn edges, dark wooden stools, the constant sound of the coffee machine as a backdrop to all conversations. A place where no one paid attention to anyone cause everyone was too absorbed in their own stuff. I recognized him before he introduced himself. 46 years old, discreet build, clothes with no striking features. The kind of person who could sit a meter away from you for 2 hours and the next day you'd be unable to describe accurately. I assumed that quality wasn't accidental. "Valentin Huro," I said as I approached. "Emilio." A brief handshake. "Sit down." There were no preambles. I laid out the case with the same structure I'd used with Montoya, the known facts, the relevant dates, the profiles of both people. He listened without interrupting, with a small notebook open on the table where he jotted down loose words I couldn't read from my angle. When I finished, he put down his pen. "What you're describing can have broad documentary scope or remain basic confirmation," he said. "It depends on how long what you suspect has truly been going on and how they've moved so far. I need at least 3 weeks to give you something solid." "Take whatever you need," I replied. "But I want certainties, not approximations. That's what they hire me for." He closed the notebook. "A warning, Mr. Herrero. During the duration of the work, your behavior at home must be absolutely normal. Any change in routine can alter the target's patterns and complicate documentation. I've been doing that since the wedding week." He observed me for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Most clients say the same and don't last even 10 days. I'm not most clients." I didn't say it with arrogance. I said it cause it was the most honest statement I could offer him at that moment. His fees were €2, 400 for the initial 3 weeks with a €600 supplement if further work was needed. We agreed on a transfer to his professional account, with no link to household documents. I accepted without negotiating. I left Saria with the same appearance I'd arrived with. A 59-year-old man in a dark coat, walking steadily, finishing a meeting and returning to his daily duties. The difference was invisible, and it weighed considerably. The following weeks built their own form of discipline, more exhausting than any workday on a construction site in adverse conditions. During the day, I managed Herrero y Asociados with a concentration that Amparo Delgado commented on with some surprise one morning. You haven't left a single file open for weeks. At this rate, you'll end the year with no pending tasks for the first time ever. I replied that I preferred to reach December without accumulated burdens. It wasn't strictly a lie. At home, each evening was an exercise in precision that didn't allow for oversights. I had dinner with Remedios, answered questions about work, watched the news, cleaned the kitchen when it was my turn, fulfilled every small ritual of coexistence with the exactitude of someone who has memorized a score and performs it note by note without needing to read it anymore. Remedios, for her part, remained completely herself. That continued to be the hardest thing to sustain. I had thought that the inner distance I carried would generate some perceptible friction between us, but there was no friction because she didn't detect any distance. For Remedios, those weeks simply represented a return to the usual cadence after the intensity of the wedding. Her mood was serene. Her gestures were as always. Her way of filling silences with everyday comments was exactly the same as any other autumn of the last 3 decades. She slept without difficulty, laughed at small things, prepared coffee on Sundays with the same punctuality as always. One Tuesday night, while I was reading in the study, she came in with a cup of chamomile tea that no one had asked for and placed it on the table next to me. "You seem tired lately," she said. "It's the year-end closings." She put a hand on my shoulder for a moment. "Don't forget to breathe once in a while." She left without waiting for an answer. I stare at the cup. The thin steam dissipated before reaching the height of the lamp. I thought that was exactly the texture of what I was experiencing, an appearance of warmth that evaporated without reaching any true place. On Tuesday of the second week, at 11:20 a.m., Emilio Cuadrado sent me a message with a single terse line, confirmation of regular contact between targets. Consistent pattern. Continuing. I read it 3 times. I deleted it. I put the phone in my desk drawer. That night, I couldn't sleep until past 3 a.m. It wasn't desperation that kept me awake. It was the particular way the brain processes the confirmation of something it already suspected, but needed to see written down to accept it without reservation. There's a concrete difference between knowing something and having it documented, between a suspicion and a recorded fact. The second condition hurts differently, with greater precision, with less room to take refuge in doubt, without the involuntary relief that sometimes offers not having complete certainty. The following week, Neria called one Sunday morning. She talked for 20 minutes about the apartment she and Inigo were renovating, the pending furniture, their immediate plans. I responded with genuine attention because my affection for my daughter hadn't changed since the night of October 14th. What had changed was the additional layer of interpretation with which I now processed every conversation with her. She made no reference to what had happened at the Parador, no indirect allusion, no question about how I was handling things. It was a call without any visible trace of that night. I hung up and held the phone for a moment. Neria's silence on that matter had its own weight, though I wasn't yet prepared to interpret exactly what it meant. I gave her the benefit of not knowing how to bring up the topic, of her also managing what she had seen in her own way. But a small, cold part of my mind noted that silence and filed it with the rest. On Thursday of the third week, at 4:42 p.m., a different message arrived. "I have relevant material for your case. Can we meet Monday without fail?" I replied with a single word. "Confirmed." I left the phone on my desk. Outside, the late October sky had that metallic gray color that in Barcelona precedes persistent rain. From the office window, I could see the row of eye-example facades, orderly and symmetrical, with that appearance of solidity that buildings built to last possess. An appearance that, as any engineer with enough years of experience knows, is never a guarantee of what's happening inside. Monday, I arrived at the same cafe in Saria with the punctuality of someone who'd spent days measuring time in hours, not days. Emilio was already seated in the back with an A4 brown paper envelope on the table and a coffee that had been there for several minutes cause it had stopped steaming. I sat down. We exchanged no more greetings than necessary. 3 weeks and 2 days, he said. He opened the envelope without ceremony and placed a folder in front of me with the specific weight of things one needs to know but doesn't wish to confirm. This is what we have. The first thing I found was a series of printed photographs with date and time in the lower right corner. Gustavo Llorente and Remedios entering a residential building in the Sant Gervasi neighborhood together. Monday, November 7th, 11:17 a.m. A second photograph of the same entrance. Thursday, November 10th, 10:49 a.m. A third. The two of them on the terrace of a restaurant in Pedralbes, sitting with the proximity of people who have no reason to maintain distance in public. Friday, November 4th, 2:53 p.m. I reviewed them with the same expression I'd used to examine a technical report confirming the worst possible scenario, not a single muscle in my face giving away free information. The apartment in Sant Gervasi, I said, rented in his name for 4 years and 2 months. Lease contract signed in September 2019. Emilio pointed to a document at the back of the folder. The relationship dates back at least as far as that date, for years and 2 months, based on documentation. I calculated it without needing anything written. The second section of the folder was more technical, an asset analysis prepared by an Emilio collaborator specializing in financial tracking. The receiving account for the transfers I detected weeks earlier was in Remedios' name, a private account at a different institution than the one we both used for all household matters, whose existence I was completely unaware of. Movements to that account began in January 2021, Emilio said. What you found on your own are the most recent and also the lowest amounts. In the first months, the amounts were considerably larger. He handed me a sheet with a breakdown by period. I read it slowly, line by line. First semester of 2021, between €800 and €1,000 monthly. Throughout 2022, the amounts dropped to figures of €400 to €700, with greater irregularity in the calendar. In 2023, up to the date of the analysis, the amounts were the most discrete and the most spaced out over time. Total accumulated in 2 years and 10 months. €27,400. I didn't say it out loud, nor did Emilio. The figure was already on the table, and we both knew what it meant. €27,400 moved from shared account to a private account, using a methodology that progressively reduced the amounts as time went on, as if the person executing it had adjusted the intensity, not out of satiety, but out of learning. Large amounts attract attention. Small ones dissolve among ordinary expenses without anyone questioning them. It was a strategy, not an impulse, not a domestic accounting slip. There's something else you should know before speaking with your lawyer. Emilio rested his elbows on the table with the tone of someone delivering the last piece of a puzzle that already had a shape. Gustavo Llorente is listed as a participant in a real estate investment company formed in 2022. The company shows no visible activity, but there's a second participant whose profile, by age group and geographical area, matches that of your wife. I don't have direct documentary confirmation because that would require avenues beyond my work. That's territory for your lawyer. I registered it without comment. In engineering, when a calculation indicates a stress point you can't yet verify with available instruments, you don't discard it. You mark it and await the appropriate tool. I paid Emilio the agreed-upon €600 supplement. I shook his hand, tucked the envelope under my arm, and walked out onto the street with my usual stride. The late November cold in Barcelona has a different texture than October's. It's stiller, more fixed in the bone, without the oscillations that make autumn bearable when it still remembers summer. I walked 3 blocks aimlessly until I stopped at the entrance of a random building and leaned my back against a stone. Tuesdays and Thursdays mornings with the regularity of a work commitment. 4 years of a parallel calendar to ours, executed while I supervised works, signed contracts, and came home believing I was returning to something solid. I thought of each of those Tuesdays, of the door closing behind me, of the farewell kiss with the same gesture as always, and of what was probably happening a few minutes after I turned the corner. Approximately 200 weeks, 200 consecutive choices to maintain something that was deliberately built behind my back. That night, I called Montoya from the study with the door closed and informed him that I had the complete documentation, including the lead about the real estate company. We agreed to meet on Wednesday at 9:30. I hung up. In the living room, Remedio's folded clothes with the television on low volume, a completely domestic sound, without any crack in the surface, the same sound that had formed the background of countless nights for 28 years. I put the envelope inside the study safe, behind the bookshelf, next to the most delicate contracts of Herrero, Y Associados, and the original blueprints of the projects that had cost me the most in this life. It was the safest place in the house, and what that envelope contained was by far the most important documentation I had ever kept there since the day I installed that safe in that wall. Wednesday's meeting with Montoya lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. With Emilio's report on the table, the legal landscape became much more defined than what I'd had at the beginning of this whole process. The lawyer reviewed the documentation with the methodology of someone who'd seen enough similar cases not to be surprised, but to know the exact points that determine the outcome. First, the asset analysis, then the dated and timed photographs, then the data on Gustavo's possible real estate company. When he finished, he took off his reading glasses and placed them on the folder. "The community property regime is your greatest exposure," he said. "Everything acquired during the marriage is distributed equally, including the increase in value of Herrero Y Associados since its incorporation. If your wife decides to go in that direction, the process can be prolonged and costly. What margin is there to protect the company? Considerable, provided we act before she knows what's underway." He put his glasses back on. "Independent expert valuation, exhaustive documentation of your personal contribution as founder, segregation of assets linked to projects prior to the marriage. It's not absolute shielding, but it significantly reduces what could be claimed in an adversarial process." He pointed to the transfer sheet. "The withdrawals from the joint account, on the other hand, are the strongest point of your entire position. €27, 400 to a private account of unilateral ownership constitutes misappropriation of common funds. With this documentation, that doesn't allow for an alternative interpretation favorable to her." I left Montoya's office with a list of concrete steps and an estimated time frame of 6 weeks to complete asset protection before making the next move. What I hadn't calculated precisely enough was the cost of time, not the economic or legal cost. The other one, the one that doesn't appear in any contract or have a column in any analysis sheet. The weeks of December demanded a different kind of resistance than maintaining the domestic facade. I'd already learned that. The new was deeper, the particular weariness of someone who carries the complete certainty of what's going to happen while everything around them continues to turn unknowingly. One night in the first week of December, I stayed at the office until almost midnight with no urgent file to justify it. Only the desk lamp on, the rest of the office in shadow. Without looking for it, the image came to me of a Sunday afternoon when Miriam must have been about 9. She'd come to the study to ask me to explain how bridges worked, and I'd spent almost 2 hours drawing force diagrams for her on graph paper, looking for a way to translate structural physics into a child's language. She looked at each drawing with a concentration that then seemed to me the simplest and most complete kind of complicity I could share with someone. I thought of that man drawing bridges for his daughter and of what that same man was doing now in that dark office. Nothing dramatic happened, just the silence and that specific sadness that doesn't need the body to participate because it works on a register tears don't reach. The following week, there was a moment that almost derailed everything. It was Wednesday afternoon. Due to an oversight I still don't fully understand, I left on the kitchen counter the notepad, where I secretly recorded the progress of the process. Abbreviations, reference numbers, nothing legible to an outsider, but out of its usual place. When I entered the kitchen, Remedios had it in her hands, flipping through it with the expression of someone not looking for anything in particular, but not stopping either. "Is this yours?" she asked without looking up. "Cost tracking for a project," I replied without stopping. I approached and took it with all the naturalness I could muster in that second. A contractor with overdue certifications was reviewing it this morning. She nodded, opened the fridge, and continued what she was doing. I walked out of the kitchen at a normal pace. I went directly to the study, closed the door, and sat down. It took several minutes for my heartbeat to stop feeling so present in my chest. That night, I transferred every note to an encrypted file on an external storage device that was then stored in the safe with Emilio's envelope. The physical notepad ceased to exist. No document related to the process ever left that space again. In mid-December, Montoya confirmed that the expert valuation of Herrero y Asociados was progressing on schedule. The protection was taking shape with the solidity of something built without haste and without errors. "Family gathering for Christmas?" he asked at the end of that call. "Dinner on the 24th with my daughter and her husband. Let happen normally. December is not the time for anything." Christmas Eve dinner unfolded with the exact appearance of any other year. Neria and Inigo arrived punctually. Large table, the wine I'd reserved weeks ago. Conversation without sharp edges. The kids' apartment. Planned trips for spring. A mutual friend who'd just become a mother for the first time. For hours without any visible crack on the surface. At no point that night did Neria make any reference to what had happened at the Parador de Cardona. Not an indirect allusion, not a loaded glance, not the slightest gesture of someone carrying a weight without being able to name it. She and Remedios chatted, laughed, shared dessert with the completely intact familiarity of always. I watched them all night from the other end of the table, and what I saw forced me to formulate with a clarity that no longer admitted postponement what until then I had preferred to leave undefined. Neria and Remedios had had their own conversation after October 14th and had reached some kind of agreement between them from which I was completely excluded. My daughter knew and had made the decision to continue as if she didn't know. I collected the plates and took them to the kitchen. I stood for a moment by the sink, with the voices from the dining room muffled from the end of the hallway. Outside, a light, unconvincing snow fell on the wet asphalt of Barcelona and melted before leaving any trace. On January 6th, 2 days after Three Kings Day, Neria called at midday. It wasn't an unusual call on the surface. We used to talk fairly often since she got married, though contact had been more spaced out than usual in recent months. I picked up with the same disposition as always, sitting in the study armchair with some blueprints spread on my lap. The first 10 minutes passed without anything alerting me to what was coming. The apartment almost finished furnishing, a dinner they'd had with Inigo's friends, the cold of those weeks. I responded with genuine attention because my daughter was still my daughter, regardless of everything else I was carrying. It was when the rhythm of the conversation changed that I understood there was a structure beneath that call, a preparation that hadn't been sufficiently disguised. "Dad, I want to talk to you about something." "I'm listening." A brief pause. The kind of pause needed by someone who has rehearsed something, but when the moment comes, discovers that the words don't fit the same way they did when prepared remotely. "I've been thinking a lot since the wedding. I've gone back to it many times." Another pause. "I know it was horrible. I know what I told you hurt you, but I also know that you and Mom have been together your whole lives, and that people make mistakes that don't define everything else." I listened until the end without interrupting. "Has your mother spoken with you?" The question came before I could decide whether to ask it direct, with no particular inflection, but with the weight of a central beam from which several things hung at the same time. Neria's silence lasted exactly long enough to confirm what I already knew from Christmas dinner. "We've talked, yes." Her voice dropped half a tone. "But this call is mine, Dad. No one asked me to make it. I'm calling you because I don't want our family to break over something that can be fixed." "And what would that solution be, according to you?" that you talk, that you give yourselves the chance to resolve it before making irreversible decisions. I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm asking you not to make it irreparable when it doesn't have to be yet. What she described had a superficially reasonable logic. If I hadn't had Emilio Quadrado's report in that study safe with 4 years of documentation, the apartment in San Gervasi, the photographs, and the 27 euros for 100, I might have recognized in her words the genuine fear of someone who doesn't want to see their family fragmented. But I had that report, and, moreover, the certainty accumulated over the last 3 months that Neria knew much more than she had revealed the night of October 14th. How long had you been suspecting something before the wedding? I asked with the same calm I would have asked anything unimportant. The silence this time was different, not of preparation, but of entrapment. That has nothing to do with what I'm telling you now. For me, it does. Dad, Neria, it wasn't a reprimand. It was the intonation of someone pointing out something that had waited for the right moment to be named. I'm not asking you for a confession. I'm asking you an honest question because I think you deserve it, and I deserve it. Another longer silence. Once, about 2 years ago, I saw a message on Mom's phone that seemed strange to me. I didn't get to read it all. I closed it and decided not to think about it anymore because I didn't want to think that. Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't want it to be what it seemed. And then time passed, and I told myself it had been a misinterpretation on my part. 2 years. With that single phrase, the map of what had happened since the wedding acquired dimension, I had only intuited until then. My daughter had had an inkling 2 years before getting married. She had filed it away, and in the months leading up to the celebration, with all that she and Remedios had planned together for almost 2 years, she chose not to stir it up. Not because the truth didn't matter to her, but because the cost of stirring it up at that moment was too high for what was at stake. I understood, and in understanding, I felt no anger towards her. I felt something quieter and more permanent than anger. The monthly transfer I've been making to your account since your wedding day, I said slowly. You've incorporated it into the apartment's budget. The question came from a cold place I recognized as new in myself. I hadn't premeditated it, but when the words were in the air, I knew they were accurate. Neria took her time responding. Dad, that's not why I called you. I know, but I'm asking you. Yes, we were counting on it for the final payments of the renovation. There was no cruelty in her answer. It was simply honest. And that honesty, which would have been perfectly normal in any other conversation between a father and a daughter receiving financial help, acquired in this context a coloration that changed everything. The €600 monthly I'd transferred to her account since the month after the wedding. It wasn't a figure that had ever been an effort for me. It was the way a father who can supports his children when they start out, with no declared conditions, with no mechanism that would turn that gesture into anything other than affection until that moment. Understand, I said. What exactly do you understand? Her voice now had new tension. I understand the complete situation. I paused. Neria, I love you. That doesn't change and won't change, but the conditions of everything else do change, and it was fair for you to know before it happens. Can I ask you what's going to happen? When there's something I can tell you, I'll tell you. Now isn't that moment. I hung up slowly, not abruptly, with the firmness of someone who has reached the end of a conversation that has nothing more to offer. I stayed in the armchair for a time I didn't measure. The blueprints were still open on the same page as before, the viaduct's load lines completely oblivious to what had just happened in that room. There's a category of pain that doesn't have a precise name because it superficially resembles other things without being any of them. It's not betrayal in the sense that applied to Remedios. It's not deliberate abandonment. It's closer to discovering that someone you loved unconditionally operated, without fully knowing it, within a logic where love had an implicit price that neither of you had ever named aloud. That's what I felt that afternoon regarding Neria. Not burning, not a sudden impact, but the specific coldness of space that was once full and that you now recognize as empty for the first time, precisely because you already know it won't be filled the same way again. That night, Remedios set the table with her usual order. We had dinner with the television on in the background like so many other nights of so many other years. At no point did she ask me if I'd spoken with Neria. nor did I mention it. And that shared silence about the call that afternoon was, without a doubt, the moment I most clearly understood that the sooner this whole process ended, the better it would be for all three of us. In the second week of January, Montoya summoned me to his office with a punctuality I interpreted as a sign that something was ready to close. He was right. The expert valuation of Herrero y Asociados had concluded with the precision I expected from a process directly supervised by the lawyer. The report clearly distinguished the foundational assets I had contributed before the marriage, the patrimonial evolution attributable exclusively to my direct management, and the assets that, under the community property regime, could legitimately be subject to distribution. The margin of protection built over the last 3 months was solid, not invulnerable, cause in law nothing is entirely so, but robust enough to withstand any adversarial process without the company being exposed at its foundations. We have a position, Montoya said, placing the report on the table. The question is whether you want to use it. Proceed with everything. I said it without pause, without the weight of someone making a difficult decision at that instant. Because that decision had been made weeks ago, and what was happening in that office was simply the formal moment of converting it into real movement. Montoya jotted something in his notepad without looking up. Divorce with request for annulment of the community property regime due to misappropriation of common funds, plus a civil action for restitution of the documented €27,400. He capped his pen. Do you want to manage the initial communication to the other party, or do we do it from here? First, I need everything sealed in our position. When there's nothing she can move before the process formally begins, then the communication. 2 more weeks. By mid-February, we'll have everything in order. 2 weeks. After more than 3 months of maintaining an architecture of silence within my own home, that figure was completely manageable. I left the office and walked to the metro station instead of calling a taxi, as I usually did when I was in that area. Not to save time or money. I needed the walk, the 10 minutes of ordinary city between that meeting and the rest of the day. January in Barcelona cast a white, temperatureless light that made the buildings sharper than usual. I observed them with the particular attention of someone who knows they're closing a period, and that when that period ends, even the way they look at the same street will be different. That afternoon, from the private office, I called Neria. She answered on the second ring with a slightly contained voice that indicated she'd identified the number and wasn't sure what she was about to hear. Hello, Dad. Neria, I'm calling to let you know something specific. I made no preambles because we both knew prolonging them would be useless. Starting next month, I won't be continuing the monthly transfer to your account. Silence. Dad, this isn't a decision made this week. It's a consequence of a process that's been underway for some time and is reaching its final phase. I wanted you to know with enough anticipation to reorganize what you need. How long have you been planning all this? Since shortly after the wedding. The silence this time had a different texture, not exactly of surprise, but of someone suddenly realizing that the ground they thought they knew had a configuration they hadn't detected. And all this time you've been acting like my father? That doesn't change and won't change, but the conditions of everything else do change, and it was fair for you to know before it happens. Can I ask what's going to happen? When there's something I can tell you, I'll tell you. Now isn't that moment? I hung up calmly, without unnecessary harshness or superfluous ceremony, with the serenity of someone who has accepted that certain decisions cannot be executed without someone being affected. And that reality doesn't make them less necessary. What happened that night, I hadn't foreseen. Remedios had prepared something more elaborate than a usual dinner, a stew. One of those she saved for winters with visitors, or for those undeclared occasions when she decided the evening deserved something better than the ordinary. The table was set with more care than usual. She had opened a bottle of wine I'd kept for months for an occasion we'd never defined. A celebration? I asked from the kitchen doorway. None. She shrugged with a brief smile. I just felt like cooking something good for once. I sat down, poured the wine, listened during dinner to her account of a household matter she'd had to resolve that afternoon. A comment about a building issue, the plan to spend the next weekend at home with no outside commitments. I watched her with an attention she couldn't see. The way she tilted the glass before drinking, the way she picked up bread with her fingers, the small silences between one sentence and the next that in other times I would fill without thinking. Cause long cohabitation builds its own automatisms that work without anyone supervising them. 30 years produce an intimacy that doesn't disappear with the decision that something has to end. That night, I understood it in a way I hadn't anticipated. That it was possible to look at someone with whom everything had concluded internally and still find the contours of a person who at another time was exactly what one needed. That the end of something doesn't erase what that something was at the time. It only changes its place. It wasn't compassion I felt, nor exactly nostalgia. It was something more neutral and more honest than both. The cold recognition that the 28 years had existed, that not all of them had been built on lies, and that reality could coexist without contradiction with what was about to happen. I retired before her that night, lying in the darkness, dinner still fresh, and the certainty that in less than 2 weeks everything would change in a way neither of us could reverse. I felt something I hadn't experienced in the previous 4 months. Not relief, not anticipated satisfaction, not any of the emotions one would expect to find at that point. Just the specific and strangely silent weight of being completely ready. Wednesday, February 19th. Dawned with a clear sky and a late winter light that promised more warmth than it actually delivered. I arrived at Montoya's office at 9:45 a.m. with the documentation organized in a gray folder, each block in its position, each reference accessible without needing to search under pressure. Remedios had received the formal notification 4 days earlier through the lawyer's office, with the instruction to appear accompanied by legal representation if she deemed it appropriate. I offered her no prior explanation. I continued with the routine during those 4 days: work, usual dinners. The news. What happened between her and that notification I observed from the distance I'd been building for months. She was quieter than usual. She checked her phone with abnormal frequency. On Thursday, she left with the excuse of an errand and was gone for almost 2 hours. When she returned, she had the expression of someone who has heard something they didn't quite want to confirm. She had contacted a lawyer. It was exactly what she should have done. The lawyer who arrived with her was named Domingo Serrano Cuesta, 53, dark blue suit, leather briefcase with worn corners. I knew his name from the industry cause he'd handled commercial cases in Izample over recent years. He wasn't an adversary without resources, but he also didn't arrive with the advantage he would have needed. Remedios entered without looking directly at me, sat on the other side of the table with Serrano to her right, and placed her hands on the wood with the posture of someone who still hadn't decided exactly how to behave during the next 90 minutes. It was the first time in over 4 months that we'd faced each other without the architecture of everyday life between us. Montoya conducted the session with the technical sobriety that characterized him, without any emotional inflection, without any element that wasn't strictly necessary for what that meeting was meant to produce. He began with the community property regime and the divorce petition. He stated it as any procedure is enumerated, with precise terminology and without unnecessary drama. Remedios listened with her jaw slightly tense. She didn't interrupt. Then Montoya opened the folder and began placing blocks of documentation on the table. First, the photographs from Emilio Cuadrado's report. The entrance to the Sant Gervasi building, the terrace of the Pedral's restaurant, the dates printed in the lower corner of each image. Remedios adjusted her shoulders in a minimal gesture, a stiffness she hadn't had until that moment. These images don't prove anything that can't be explained as. Allow us to finish, Montoya said with a courtesy that left no room for rebuttal. He continued with the financial analysis, the €27, 400, the chronological breakdown since January 2021, the progressive reduction methodology in the amounts. The private account whose existence had never come up in any conversation between us in almost 3 decades. Serrano took notes without looking up. Remedios left her pen on the table at some point during that presentation. I opened that account for personal expenses that I preferred not to mix with household ones. 27,400 euros in 22 months. Montoya didn't say it with irony. He stated it as a fact that was considerably more effective than any sarcasm. With this documentation, the legal classification of those movements doesn't admit the interpretation you propose. Serrano briefly placed his hand on Remedios's forearm, the universal gesture of someone telling their client to stop speaking for the moment. In all that time, I hadn't uttered a single word. I then looked directly at her for the first time since we'd entered, not with hostility, but with the clear attention of someone who can finally observe something, without any need to disguise what they see. Remedios held my gaze for a few seconds and then averted it toward the window. That was the only moment of the entire meeting that cost me something physical, not the anger or the pain themselves, but the concrete verification that what had existed between us was visibly and irreversibly ending at that moment, that 28 years don't disappear because something has tainted them retrospectively, but that reality also doesn't change what was happening in that room. What followed was technical, methodical, and completely dispassionate. Serrano requested time to review the complete documentation. Montoya set the timelines. The family home, assets linked to Herrero y Asociados, and a civil claim for diverted funds were discussed, each point addressed with the coldness of an inventory. Remedios spoke little. When she did, it was in concrete terms, no longer attempting any alternative narrative that the documentation could dismantle in under 30 seconds. The meeting concluded at 12:23 p.m. In the hallway, as the lawyers exchanged a few words down the corridor, Remedios stopped beside me with her coat still folded over her arm. "How long have you been preparing all this?" "Long enough to do it well." She looked at me. In her expression wasn't what I would have anticipated. There was no breakdown or declared hostility. There was something closer to the recognition of someone who understands, too late, the real dimension of what they had in front of them without having seen it. "I didn't think you were capable," she said. "I know. That was the underlying problem, and we both knew it without needing to add anything else." The second meeting of that day occurred at 4 p.m. in a room Montoya had reserved specifically for that encounter. Gustavo Llorente arrived with his own lawyer, a younger man whose attention showed he didn't have enough experience to completely hide it. Montoya, in exactly 10 minutes, laid out my client's position, the existing documentation, its link to the ongoing divorce process, and the formal notification that any future contact with Remedios during the procedure or with any member of my family could lead to additional legal actions with considerable consequences for his personal and professional situation. Gustavo listened with his eyes fixed on the table surface. He made no statement. His lawyer spoke on his behalf during the last few minutes with the brevity of someone who knows their client has no real room to elaborate. He signed the acknowledgement and commitment document before the meeting reached 35 minutes. He left without ever meeting my gaze. Back at the office, around 6 p.m., Amparo found me in the hallway and asked if I'd had a good day. I replied, long but resolved. She nodded as usual and went on her way without pressing. I settled at my desk in the now silent office. Through the eye-sample windows, the lights of the buildings across the street began to turn on one by one as evening fell. Hundreds of illuminated windows, each with its own inward-turned story, completely oblivious to what had happened that day a few blocks away. I placed the viaduct file, which had been waiting on the edge of my desk for weeks, in front of me. For the first time in 4 months, the only thing inside those pages were engineering calculations. The divorce process concluded on Thursday, September 12th, 8 months after that February meeting in Montoya's office. 8 months during which Herrero y Asociados continued to function with the precision of machinery that doesn't depend on the emotional state of its director. We closed 3 new contracts in the first semester. We signed the bid for a road infrastructure project in Tarragona that had been the study phase for 2 years. and Amparo organized the first results review, where I arrived with all the documentation prepared without anyone having to remind me. Outside, time continued to turn with its characteristic indifference. Inside, things had their own calendar. The family home remained in my name, with a compensatory economic charge agreed upon within the process. Remedios had moved into a rental apartment in the Gracia neighborhood, which I learned about without seeking it, through an indirect comment from Amparo, who in turn had heard it from someone unimportant. I asked no more. It wasn't my place, and I wasn't interested. The restitution of the €27 for 100 was executed by bank transfer on Monday, September 15th, 3 days after the formal close of the procedure. Montoya sent me the confirmation in a 4-line message with his usual sobriety. I read it from the breakfast table, alone in the kitchen of an apartment that now had different dimensions in the mornings. And I didn't experience any of the sensations one would expect to find upon receiving that kind of news. Not satisfaction, not relief in the sense that something painful relieves. Only the objective confirmation that what needed to be in order was in order. Herrero y Asociados exited the process without any forfeiture of participation. The expert valuation we had built with such precision the previous autumn proved to be exactly as solid as Montoya had anticipated. The patrimony I had taken decades to build remained intact, and that integrity did not fill me with particular pride because I never considered it a personal achievement, but simply the correction of something that should never have been at risk. Amparo knew when the process had already ended, the minimum necessary to understand why certain aspects of the last few months had the texture they did. She received it with the discretion that characterizes her since I've known her. "Well done," was all she said, and in her way of saying it, there was a solidity that needed no additional words. In October, exactly 1 year after Neria's wedding, Inigo called me. It wasn't the first time he'd done so since the procedure had been activated. We'd maintained the kind of contact two people keep when the bond uniting them is under a tension neither of them generated. Inigo had always been direct, and this time was no different. "Neria wants to see you, Valentine." "I know. I'm not asking anything you don't want to happen. I'm just telling you she's having a difficult year." "Inigo," I paused. "Take good care of her, and take good care of your marriage. That's what I ask of you." I hung up without drama, with the same serenity with which I'd learned to move the complicated pieces of this whole process, without emotion overflowing precision. Neria had called me twice before that call from Inigo. The first in June, when the process was still active, the second in August, with a voice that carried the weight of someone who had mentally rehearsed the same conversation too many times before dialing the number. Both times I listened to her. Both times I responded with only what was strictly necessary and hung up without leaving room for the part she wanted to reach. It wasn't an inability to forgive, not exactly. It was the understanding that certain forms of trust aren't restored with time or with the will of those who fractured them, cause they were never deliberately broken, but simply managed with a different priority than one expected. And that kind of crack doesn't bleed, but it also doesn't mend the same way it did before it existed. I loved her. That remained intact with the same solidity as always, but the way I loved her had changed its configuration. It was an affection that now operated with a distance that didn't exist before, and that distance wasn't calculated punishment, but simply the form love took when ingenuity was no longer available to sustain it as before. I moved in November to an apartment in the El Cal neighborhood, on the 4th floor of an east-facing building whose renovation I'd partially supervised 8 years earlier. I chose it because I knew its load lines, and because from the balcony you can see a strip of Tibidabo that in the afternoons has a particular light that you can't quite describe, but that you recognize as your own from the first time you see it. I furnished it functionally and without urgency. Books that had been stored for years without space in the previous house. My father's oak desk, which Remedios had always considered incompatible with the living room's aesthetic. The original blueprints of Herrero y Asociados' first projects framed in the hallway that had previously been rolled up in the study for the same aesthetic reasons. It was a space that resembled what I would have chosen if I'd chosen for myself from the beginning. On the first Monday of December, I arrived at the office with the Tarragona Viaduct project in its final review phase and January's agenda already organized with pending contracts. Amparo had left a cup of coffee on my desk and a year-end report that still smelled of freshly printed paper. I sat outside. Barcelona had that particular December of hers, the city that never quite surrenders entirely to winter, that retains a certain warmth on its terraces late into the evening, and that holds on to that mix of movement and permanence on its Ramblas that distinguishes it from any other place I know. I thought of Neria, not with the sharp pang of the first few months, but with the stillness of someone who accepts that certain distances don't close cause you wish them to, but cause there's a structural reason behind them that doesn't disappear with the mere passage of time. I thought of Remedios, without anger, without the specific weight of the previous months, with the neutrality of someone who has processed something to its final state and filed it in a place where it no longer interferes with what comes next. And I thought for the first time since that night of October 14th at the Parador de Cardona about what lay ahead, my father's oak desk, the cup of coffee on it, Amparo across the hall, the strip of Tibidabo in the afternoons from the balcony. 30 years of work that remained standing exactly where I had left them, without concession or diminishment, cause I had built them on something no one had been able to touch. It wasn't an image of arrival. It was simply what remained when you stop carrying what no longer belongs to you. Enough to start.